All right, we are back. Round 3 and round 4. Picking at the 312, 401. Had to wait a little while to get on the clock. Took Daniel Jones at 212. And as someone pointed out to me, which I did not look at, was Daniel Jones and Josh Allen's bye week. Did not expect Daniel Jones to be there at the 212, but he was. But now I ended up with two quarterbacks with the same bye week. So I immediately shifted my strategy as I ended the second round show. As anyone remembers, I actually ended up with the thought of I would be able to punt my third QB spot and essentially just wait till the very end, maybe add it at the last minute. But now I've kind of changed tunes and decided that I'm probably going to go with the third QB, especially based on the way this league is drafting. Able to double tap here. I had 3 players that I was going to consider, actually 4. As we got on the clock, as you can see, the WoRP chart that I'm posting, but I'm going to put the draft up here as well. Before the day started, we were at the 310. Josh ADHD took A.J. Brown. That would have been one of the receivers I would have considered. If you're actually looking at the WoRP distribution, he's one of the ones where you could envision finishing in that high WoRP range for receivers. Then Josh Jacobs and Ramondre Stevenson were the 2 running backs that I was going to consider, and then potentially a quarterback. So back to the WoRP. Already started with 2 QBs. As you can see, I'm going to remove tight end because we're not going to draft tight ends at this point. So removing the tight ends, you can kind of see where the WoRP distribution intersects here between quarterbacks and the wide receivers. Running backs, clearly pretty much the dominant position. If I was to double tap here, the consideration would have been Josh Jacobs and Ramondre Stevenson. But in this case, since Jacobs went, I do think the next best player on the board is going to be a quarterback. So I'm going to remove receivers and just kind of talk through a little bit my strategy here. I think there's a running back drop-off tier. If I'm trying to aim for a running back that can hit into this range, right? So you're talking where, for instance, Ramondre Stevenson, Tony Pollard were last year. Obviously, Josh Jacobs is going to be way up there in terms of where the running backs would be from last season. Jacobs was all the way up at the very, very top. As I refresh the WoRP chart. But Jacobs obviously being at the very top. I'm aiming for a player that's going to give me probably the 1+ WoRP that I'm looking at in this format. And clearly the running backs are dominant over the wide receivers. So given where we're at on the board, looking at the running backs that have come off, it was Ramondre, it was Josh Jacobs, it was A.J. Brown, and it was Geno Smith at quarterback. Now, the question here remains, given that I have 2 quarterbacks with the same bye and that I don't pick for another 22 picks after this, do I want to risk going with a third QB where I do think it drops off? If you look at Geno Smith, you look at his WoRP last year, it was up there inside the top 10. So again, would supplement essentially that week where I have both other quarterbacks on the bye. It does happen to be the first round of the rolling playoffs as well. So it presents a little bit of a problem. I didn't want to take the third QB here, but I do think it'll push the board. There's 2 teams that don't have a quarterback in my division. There's 4 other teams that only have 1 quarterback. So when you look at this, by the sheer number of points, I am still taking a quarterback in the same WoRP range right here, Geno Smith, and then obviously Ramondre Stevenson was right here. So very similar, just in terms of the actual roster construction. It pushes me right at that brink. It pushes me right at that 3. So there's no way I'm taking 4. And really the only time I would add one is if I can add one during the season at some point in lieu of probably a roster spot later on in the year after bye weeks have hit. So with that, I'm going to lock in my picks. Geno Smith at the 312, which will be my QB3. Ramondre Stevenson at the 401. I did check. There were 13 teams that do have the Josh Allen, Daniel Jones stack. None of them ended up with Geno Smith. None of them ended up with Ramondre Stevenson thus far, but I'm almost guaranteeing myself, yes, it's a little bit of a risk taking 3 QBs to start, but nobody else is going to have that build. So being one of those teams that's already going to be unique with Josh Allen and with Daniel Jones on the same team, adding in the third with Geno Smith is going to give me a very unique start of 4 players. So that's where I'm going to lock it in. So we're going to lock in these picks. Lock in Geno Smith. And we are going to lock in Ramondre Stevenson at the 401. And again, some people will say, man, you're passing up on CD Lamb. The other consideration here was Darren Waller, given that I have Daniel Jones. But I'm okay with it. I'm going to lock in Ramondre. We'll be back at the 5-6 turn in 22 picks and see how things shake out. Be chill.